I'm responsible.
For what?
For what happened to Uncle Ben. I shot him. I held his hand when he died. I've tried to tell you so many times.
Spider-Man Triple Action Web Blaster.
The only thing this game doesn't have are some triple action web blasters. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another infectious installment of Radioactive Review. And even though you guys showed lots of support for my Ultimate Spider-Man Radioactive Review, I do think this is the one that you guys have been waiting for the most. And after fully replaying and reviewing the majority of all the previous Spider-Man games that have come out in the past, and seeing how this is my last one for now, I'm just really happy that you guys have been liking this series so far. And it means a lot to me that you guys are tuning in for this one, so thank you so much. And of course, before I fully go in reviewing this game, I have to shout out the one and only Ricky Franklin for being so awesome and making the Radioactive Replay logo that you have been seeing in all my thumbnails. So thank you so much, Ricky. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. But you guys should know how Radioactive Review works by now. We fully break down and review each single aspect of the Spider-Man game that we just finished replaying. This, of course, ranges from reviewing the story, gameplay, graphics, soundtrack, as well as pointing out some pros and cons about the game, and ending it with the worst moment and the best moment of the game, and of course giving my final score of the overall game. And obviously, the thing that we have to bring out right now is the story of the game. So besides the fact that Spider-Man 2's traversal is considered to be the best traversal in any single open-world Spider-Man game, another reason why people love Spider-Man 2 so much is because of the really great narrative that the game has. Not only does this movie tie-in game fully go over the main narrative of the movie's plot perfectly well, it also does a really great job of expanding the movie's story. This, of course, goes by adding different villains in the game that were not in the movie before, like Shocker and Mysterio, as well as getting some really interesting conversation pieces with Black Cat. And of course, the main focus on what Insomniac Games is taking with Spider-Man's narrative in Spider-Man PS4 is that the worlds of Peter Parker and Spider-Man's worlds collide with one another really well in this game's story. The majority of the game focuses on the same aspect of the movie's narrative, where Peter is struggling to balance the life of himself and Spider-Man at the same time. And the way on how the game handles it, with him fighting Doc Ock as well as beating up all these other bad guys in the city while missing some really important events as Peter, is really awesome. And I personally think that Treyarch did an excellent job with expanding this movie's narrative within the game. However, the next point I want to bring up, which some of you guys may not like my opinion on, is the graphics of the game. So keep in mind that this game was in fact made in 2004, and this was the very first open-world Spider-Man game ever made. So since this is the case, Treyarch really decided to focus on creating a really big open world for the player to explore in New York City. So this is why you see New York City in the game having really great architecture being built around the entire map of the game. So while the overall city looks really good for back in 2004, the character models themselves don't look all that great. Everyone's character model in the game looks a bit choppy, and also the graphics of the overall game of Spider-Man 2002 actually look way better than they do in this game. But again, as I said previously, this was the very first open world game that was ever made for Spider-Man, and Treyarch mainly focused their resources on creating a really great looking New York City compared to making the character models look really great. This is why the overall design and textures for the character models in Spider-Man 2002 look much better than they do in this game. Still, for what the resources that Treyarch had back in 2004, I do think that they did an overall good job with the game's graphics. And moving on to one of my favorite parts about the game is the amazing soundtrack that comes along with it. Now, for me personally, I always go back and forth between deciding what my favorite soundtrack in a Spider-Man game is. Sometimes it's Web of Shadows or Ultimate Spider-Man, but mainly it is almost always Spider-Man 2. Every single character in the game, including New York City itself, has really awesome theme songs attached to it, as well as the overall aesthetic of the soundtrack appealing to the vibe of New York City is amazing. Sometimes the soundtrack becomes really fast-paced when you're fighting enemies, or it becomes really dramatic during certain parts of the game, or just is very mellow when swinging around the city. So no matter what you're doing in the game, the soundtrack will overall always blow you away. And that is easily already one of my favorite parts about this game. So now, with all those main points out of the way, everyone, we are going to move on with the pros and the cons of the game. So of course, I have more pros about this game than I do with cons, but there are still quite a few cons that I do have with the overall game itself, so we're going to start off with those. So the first con that I have is a very small one, is that there is no difficulty setting for the game. However, there is a difficulty setting when it comes to the swinging of the game, which I do actually really like. But for the overall game itself, there is only a default difficulty that applies to the standard player who is playing this game, and even though the game does provide a moderate challenge, it doesn't feel all that challenging when you do replay it again. Still, that's not too bad on this list. So the second con that I have with this game is actually all of the tokens that that you can find in the city. Usually when games have collectibles, they oftenly provide incentives for the player to go out and collect them to get a reward at the end. And even though this game does give you certain types of quote-unquote achievement titles when you do collect a whole set of tokens, you mainly gain hero points at the end of each token set that mainly don't get you anything after you've already unlocked all the upgrades in the Spidey store. So while they are fun distractions in the city just to randomly collect tokens that you can come across, they don't really do anything in regards to the main game. They do offer you hero points, but you can mainly get those by doing any other type of mission in the city. So for me personally, even though they are fun to collect, I don't think that the tokens should be in the game at all. At least you were able to unlock certain suits after collecting a certain amount of tokens in Ultimate Spider-Man, but here you just get titles, and I don't personally think it's worth collecting all of them if you're just gonna get that. So now for my final con about the game is actually the camera of when Spidey is swinging in the city. So when it comes to fighting bad guys in the city to actually traversing around the game, you actually do feel really well in control when playing Spider-Man in the game. However, when you start to build up momentum and swing really fast in the game, the camera is actually a little bit too far out from Spider-Man. Granted, one thing that you could argue is that Treyarch did this on purpose to give you the full scope of the city to make it feel like it is this really large world, but it is still really far away from Spider-Man when you're traversing around the city. And I do understand that some of you guys prefer the camera being farther away from Spider-Man, while other people actually prefer the really close-up camera that the Amazing Spider-Man 1 game had. But for me personally, I like to have it right in the middle, just like in Spider-Man Web of Shadows or even Ultimate Spider-Man, where the camera wasn't too far away but not too close. So while the camera in this game doesn't get on my nerves too much, I would have preferred if the camera was a bit closer to Spider-Man when you were swinging around the city. Still, I do get the vibe that Treyarch was trying to provide with that specific camera angle, and I do really appreciate what they did there. So now with all the cons out of the way, everybody, we are going to move on with the pros of this list. And of course, the first pro for me is the amazing voice cast that is in this game. Now, as I've said in my previous reviews, it is always great when you're making a movie tie-in game to get the actors from the movie to voice their respective characters in the game. So for example, Tobey Maguire voices Peter Parker, Alfred Molina does an amazing job voicing Doc Ock, and Kristen Dunst actually voices Mary Jane in this game as well. And even though it's not James Franco, Josh Keaton does an amazing job as voicing Harry Osborn in this game. And some of the lines that these characters deliver in this game do an amazing job overall. And given the fact that the majority of the actors from the movie actually came back to voice their characters in the game, just makes it that much more memorable for all the Spider-Man fans out there. And I know for a fact that some of the lines Tobey delivers in this game are hands down genius. So the next pro that I have on this list are actually all the awesome combos that you can get in the game. Now, even though combat has been handled several different ways in a number of Spider-Man games, this game actually is the inspiration for the Batman Arkham games combat. This is mainly because of the button layout that came out with the controls when fighting enemies in the game. So for Spider-Man, you usually would use circle to dodge, square to attack, triangle to use your webs, and X to jump. And of course for Batman Arkham, you use circle to stun enemies, triangle to counter, square to attack, and X to evade. So obviously you can see that Batman took lots of inspiration from this game's combat, and it definitely shows, because this game's combat is very in-depth and very detailed, and especially very fun. Not only does it feel really fluid and stylistic when fighting all the enemies in the game, you can actually pull off some really cool combos when mixing and matching the button presses together. So for example, pressing square would give you a standard attack, but if you press square twice, then press triangle, then press X, you are able to hang an enemy on a lamppost. And this is hands down one of the coolest parts about this game's combat. And not only is it extremely fun to do this combat, but if you keep mixing and matching these button presses together, you'll always find something new within the game's combat system. And that just makes it more and more interesting. So the next pro that I have with the game is actually the giant map of New York City. So again, being the very first open world Spider-Man game ever, it is really impressive on what Treyarch was able to do with creating such a big map for the game. Back in 2004, that was when the old school GTA games were coming out, and those games were really popular with open world settings. And mainly Treyarch's goal with Spider-Man 2 was to replicate that awesomeness within an open world Spider-Man game. And the fact that back in 2004, you were able to fully explore the island of Manhattan and Staten Island itself with exploring different landmarks like Central Park, Times Square, and even the Statue of Liberty, it's really impressive on what Treyarch was able to do with this game's open world. And this is by far one of the best open world maps in any Spider-Man game ever. So the second to last pro that I have with Spider-Man 2, everyone, is actually the really awesome and fully detailed side missions that are totally abundant within the game. Not only can you freely do any of these missions and as much as you want when trying to swing around the city, and you'll always be able to interact with civilians giving you tasks in the game as well, you're also able to do awesome missions at the Daily Bugle, deliver pizzas, do challenge modes, and so on. Especially with the amount of races and hint markers that can be found throughout the city, you'll always be able to do something fun. And the fact that Treyarch gave you this much variety and depth when making the very first open world Spider-Man game is absolutely nuts. And this is one of the main reasons why Spidey fans to this day still go back and claim that Spider-Man 2 is one of the best Spider-Man games of all time, is mainly because of the awesome side missions that are in it. And it's super obvious to tell why the side missions in Spider-Man 2 is one of the best aspects about this game. So now for my very last pro, everyone, is actually the Spidey store in the game. So even though the Spidey store is simply just an upgrade menu for Spider-Man to buy different upgrades for him to use in the game, I just love the light detail that Treyarch put in by just going into a store and accessing a menu to buy upgrades. This can either be in a shopping mall or a gym or a comic book store, but you'll always be able to find different stores located throughout the city and buy upgrades for Spider-Man. And the fact that Treyarch put that little fun detail in the game just to make Spider-Man more powerful as you keep progressing through the game is just awesome. So now with all the pros and cons out of the way, everyone, we are going to now move on to the best and worst moments of the game overall. Now the first best moment that I actually have with Spider-Man 2 is obviously the traversal. And honestly, everything about Spider-Man 2's traversal has already been said. The swinging is clearly physics-based, webs attached to buildings, it's fast, fluid, fun, stylistic, and absolutely fast-paced. I also personally think that it's very easy to get the hang of, and once you start doing more and more cool tricks in the game, you'll actually discover new methods of traversal by yourself. And this gives the player more incentive to discover new ways on how to traverse around the city, like wall running, pole swinging, web slingshotting, or just dual swinging. And the fact that the very first open world Spider-Man game offered this much variety of traversal is insane. And that is definitely a huge accomplishment on Treyarch's part. And of course, for me, the second best moment of the game is easily Black Cat for, obvious reasons.
Who?
What? Who? Who are you? What is... Okay. Oh.
You got nice moves for a dork in tights.
Oh.
Are these yours?
Please.
Wait!
No, where you going? Come back. We just want to talk. And get some dinner. No, but seriously, the fact on why I like Black Cat so much is that her character is actually a narrative aspect about the duality of Peter Parker and Spider-Man's relationship. Throughout the game, Peter struggles consistently with trying to balance the life of Spider-Man and being Peter Parker at the same time, while Black Cat is actually trying to encourage him to embrace his Spider-Man life. And every time you encounter Black Cat in the game, her missions become more and more intriguing and more fun. Plus, the relationship that Peter and Felicia build over the course of the game is something that's really awesome. And for me personally, besides Spider-Man, Black Cat is easily my favorite character in the game. So now for my worst moment of the game is sadly that it is way too short. This is the same problem that I had with Ultimate Spider-Man Story, is that for whatever reason, the Spider-Man games back in the early 2000s were really short. Even though there's a lot of side missions that you can do in the game, like delivering pizzas and taking photos for the Daily Bugle, the overall main campaign is less than 6 hours. Plus, during certain parts of the game, you're forced to do certain side missions that will progress through the story, as well as gain more hero points to access a certain point of the game's narrative. So even though it is fun to do all these side missions in the game, it sometimes can come off as a bit irritating trying to get more hero points just to access the next chapter in the game. And overall, guys, this is considered to be not only the best movie tie-in game of all time, but hands down the best Spider-Man game ever made, and with good reason. Now for me personally, even though the graphics were not as good back then in 2004 as they are now, and while the story is very short, this is easily one of the best Spider-Man games ever made. And even though my personal favorite Spider-Man game is Web of Shadows and my second favorite Spider-Man game is Ultimate Spider-Man, this is my third favorite Spider-Man game of all time. And with that and all the reasons I just provided, I am going to give Spider-Man 2 a solid 9 out of 10. Story is fantastic, soundtrack is phenomenal, and the gameplay overall with the swinging is absolutely mind-blowing. And like I said in one of my previous videos, I hands down believe that Insomniac can definitely beat Spider-Man 2's web swinging with Spider-Man PS4. But still, only time will tell, and we'll just have to wait and see. But anyways, guys, that was my Radioactive review for Spider-Man 2. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'm very happy that I was able to do all these reviews before E3. But don't you worry, Spidey Squad, I'm still going to be playing Spider-Man PS1 and Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro very soon. So even though we just finished all the Radioactive reviews for all the previous Radioactive replays, we still have a new series of games to play, so just stay tuned for that. But anyways, guys, those were all my thoughts about Spider-Man 2. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What do you think about Spider-Man 2? Do you love it, like it, or hate it? And do you think it is the best Spider-Man game of all time, or is it actually a little bit overrated? I know for a fact I'd love to hear your thoughts about the game, and I'm very interested to see what conversation we can have in the comments section down below. But once again, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Peace out.
Wow, Cat. I had no idea you
felt that way. Cat? Here, kitty, kitty, kitty.